Okay, we're going to get started as people are just entering the room here. Welcome to Congregation Beth Yeshurun's special program this morning. We have a very special frequent guest here today. I'm Rabbi Morgan, by the way, one of the rabbis at Congregation Beth Yeshurun. And our special guest this morning is Dr. Joshua Furman, who is the founder and curator of the Houston Jewish History Archive at Rice University. And he is also the associate director and lecturer in the program in Jewish studies at Rice. He has offered courses in immigration history, American Judaism, Black Jewish relations, and most recently, Jewish food. And of course, this morning, he's going to be talking about the famous Galveston Plan, by which many Jews came to America through the port of Galveston. He is going to write an article. He has an article about Jewish immigration into Texas via the Galveston Movement, which will appear in the 2022 issue of Southern Jewish History. So you can look for that article after this talk, which will surely give you much interest in the article. He's currently working on a book project about the history of Houston's Jewish community from the 1880s to the present. Before I turn the program over to him, I just want to mention that if you have a question, we're not unmuting people. You won't be able to unmute. So if you have a question, please put it in the public chat section, and we'll have people monitoring that to sort of accumulate and not repeat questions so that we'll be able to ask Dr. Furman questions. As I said, you won't be able to unmute. And so without further ado, and to give maximum time to Dr. Furman, take it away, Josh.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much to Rabbi Morgan, to Ashley, and to Jennifer at Beth Yeshurun for inviting me to give this presentation and for organizing it. It's absolutely incredible that there are more than 180 people watching this right now. If you could all fit in my office, that would be quite something, but you can't. But you're able to join and learn with me due to the magic of Zoom technology, which is really great. I'm going to speak for about 40 or 45 minutes or so, and I hope to have plenty of time for comments and questions, which is Rabbi Morgan indicated you can submit using the chat feature. I'll also share my email and my phone number at the end of the talk, and so if there's a question that you wanted to ask or something occurs to you later, or you have the diary of your grandmother who came through Galveston and you're looking for an archive to donate it to, I will be very excited, of course, to speak with you later. So without further ado, why don't we go ahead and I'm going to share my screen and we'll talk about the Galveston movement. So we're going to examine an important and I think a very still understudied chapter in United States and Texas Jewish history, which is something called the Galveston Movement. And for those of you unfamiliar with this, in a nutshell, between 1907 and 1914, slightly fewer than 10,000 Eastern European Jewish immigrants came to the United States, not through Ellis Island in New York City, but through the port at Galveston Island in Texas. From there, the majority of them fanned out to destinations across the Midwest and the heartland of the country, but about 2,500 of them, as we'll see, stayed in Texas. And in the process, they helped to grow what were at the time very small Jewish communities, such as the one here in Houston, as well as others in Dallas, Fort Worth, and even smaller cities such as Port Arthur, Corsicana, and Palestine. Their travel was coordinated and subsidized by Jewish organizations working across international boundaries to get Jews out of Eastern Europe and provide them with economic opportunities in America. So why did this happen? Let's see here, just a minute. There we go, now you can see better. So why did these immigrants come to America? Why did they come through Galveston? How were Yiddish-speaking Jews living in Eastern Europe convinced to get on a boat and come, of all places, to Texas in search of a better life? And then finally, what caused the program to shut down in 1914? These are some of the questions we're going to try to answer over the next 45 minutes. In order to do that, we have to step back a little bit and consider not just what was happening in Texas in 1907, but what was happening both in the United States and in Eastern Europe. So the era of the Galveston Movement falls within a larger period in American and American Jewish history, which is sometimes called the era of mass migration. And it's in this period, roughly from 1880 to 1924, that more than 2.5 million Jews make their way to the United States. To give you a sense of the staggering number here, 1/3 of the total Jewish population of Eastern Europe left in this period. And from the hindsight of 2022, we can say, thank God, thank goodness that they did. 90% of that group went to the United States. So we're talking about a period in which the United States goes from having a relatively small Jewish community, all things considered, somewhere around 250,000 in 1880, to by the middle of the 1920s, more than 2.5 million. So it's a staggering jump, demographically speaking. It's also important to note, looking beyond Jewish history, that this is a period not only of mass Jewish migration, but of mass human migration. And you can see these numbers on your screen. More than 5 million European immigrants left for America in the period before the end of the Civil War. And you can see how that number jumps through the end of the 19th century and into the first decades of the 20th century. So really, right, Jews are just one part of a much broader global phenomenon of migration at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And it also includes non-Western immigrants. We don't have time today to really talk about the fascinating story and the struggles of Chinese immigrants to America, but this is also a period in which Chinese immigrants, while it was legal for them to do so, made their way to the United States in search of a better life. Immigration historians speak about push and pull factors. Push factors are the reasons why you leave your country of origin, and pull factors are the reasons why you choose to immigrate to a specific place. So what are the push factors driving so many Jews out of Eastern Europe in the 1880s and beyond? Well, it has to do with pogroms, persecution, and poverty. Pogroms, of course, refer to waves of anti-Jewish mob violence that occurred periodically throughout Eastern Europe after 1881. There was a particularly devastating pogrom that you may be familiar with in the town of Kishinev in 1903 that made international news. And so in part, Jews are fleeing because of this relentless anti-Semitic violence. But anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe wasn't restricted to violent outbursts, of course. There were also a series of legal discriminatory measures that were taken by the Tsarist government against Jews, which strengthened beginning in the 1880s and made it harder for a Jewish person to live, to get an education, to pursue an occupation, and so on and so forth. But above all of these, when historians, consider what made life in Eastern Europe so miserable for Jews, stark, crushing poverty ranked at the top of the list. And one of the themes that you'll see today is when we look at how the organizers of the Galveston movement worked to try to convince Eastern European Jews to come to Galveston and to settle either in Texas or elsewhere in the United States, the chance at a better life, the opportunities that America could offer them in terms of jobs was, at least in their mind, the number one selling point. And this is why. So the vast majority of that 2.5 million Jews who came here from the 1880s to the 1920s came through Ellis Island, and the vast majority of that number stayed in New York City. And it's no secret, it's no mental gymnastics are required to try to figure out why. In major cities like New York and elsewhere, in Boston and Philadelphia and Chicago, what we call ethnic enclaves sprung up, right? These neighborhoods of high immigrant population density where languages such as Yiddish were spoken on the street. There was a vibrant Yiddish theater scene, Yiddish newspapers, synagogues of various denominational stripes, kosher food was available in abundance, right? So it's no accident that right, the largest Jewish community in the United States, right, continued to be present in New York City. However, for as much as New York City offered all these enticements that we spoke about in terms of religious and cultural and political organizations, it often meant for these immigrants and their children living in overcrowded, cramped, dirty, and unsanitary tenements. And it meant for the majority of them laboring in really unpleasant, difficult sweatshops in the garment industry in New York and other urban centers. And so this not only was unpleasant for the immigrants that endured it, but it attracted the attention of the American public. And what you begin to see is a rising wave of xenophobia, of anti-immigrant sentiment in American culture and politics in this same period. It's a time when not only is immigration changing the face of America, but also other factors as well, urbanization, the shift from a majority of Americans living in rural areas and making their living by farming, to a majority of Americans living in cities and making a living through industry. And the America of 1920 looks very different than the America of 1870. Right? We've gone to a society where Jews, Catholics, and Asians, and of course, Black Americans are newly emancipated, but not yet granted legal equality, are changing the fabric of American life. And so Jews, along with other immigrants and African Americans, become a scapegoat for all of the problems that America, as it's changing and maturing in the late 19th century and early 20th century, all of these issues: urban crime, political corruption, economic depressions, and so on and so forth. And so what you begin to see both in the halls of Congress and in elite cultural and political circles, as well as in populist ones, is a push to close the gates, to impose increasingly severe and restrictive immigration policies and quotas. The Immigration Restriction League is an important part of this story. It was an organization founded in 1894, not by a group of far-right radicals, but by 3 Harvard University alumni, whose expressed goal was to encourage and advocate for the restriction of immigration, as you can see here on your screen. And it wasn't limited to Harvard circles either. These are 2 popular magazine and newspaper cartoons from the late 1880s and 1890s. I believe, I don't have the dates in front of me immediately, in which you can see that in the popular imagination, immigrants are being compared to literally walking time bombs, right? Carrying undesirable baggage with them, their religious and cultural and political beliefs. This image on the right of a ship literally stuffed to the gills, as it were, with Jewish immigrants, almost like it's a missile, aimed at Ellis Island in New York, speaks to the degree to which many Americans believed in the early 1900s that immigrants posed a severe and intrinsic threat to America and to an American way of life. And so this is the background within which we need to try to understand the Galveston movement and the mindset of the organizers and the funders who made it possible. Just a minute. Okay, so what were those concerns driving the Galveston movement? On the one hand, as we've just seen, right? In response to this high level of pervasive xenophobia, American Jewish communal leaders feared that an anti-immigrant backlash could lead to severe changes in American immigration policy. And ultimately, they were right. It would take into the 1920s for Congress to make these changes, but by 1924, quotas of national origin were passed and were put in place that made it not impossible, but severely difficult for Eastern European Jews to enter the United States. And just coincidentally, this is a development that had a personal impact on my own family. My family left Eastern Europe in the late 1920s and early 1930s and ended up settling in Mexico City because America was not a viable immigration destination for them. So this is a story that has personal resonance for me, as I'm sure it has personal resonance for many of you watching and listening to this program. Communal leaders also worried that a general rise in anti-Semitism would affect all American Jews, even ones who were acculturated, who had been in America for a generation or more, right? Any kind of anti-Semitism is bad anti-Semitism, in other words, and so something needed to be done about it. And then as conditions continued to worsen in Eastern Europe, particularly with the Kishinev pogrom that we spoke about a few minutes ago, that further heightened the urgency, the need to get Jews out. But they can't all go to New York City, of course, right? The tenements are already full. Work in sweatshops is miserable, it's low paying, and it's also seasonal, right? Many sweatshops would open and close according to demand. So it wasn't really an ideal, viable option for rescuing the majority of Eastern European Jews who were trying to get to America. And so enter the Galveston Movement. The origins of this movement actually date to 1901, when an organization called the Industrial Removal Office was established. It's not a very attractive name, right? The Industrial Removal Office, but it speaks to the goals of what this group tried to do. Their mission was to convince immigrants already settled in New York to leave New York and to go to other cities and towns in America where they figured economic job prospects and the standard of living could be better. And so what they did was they provided these folks with train tickets to go to places like Cleveland, Ohio, for example, or Fort Worth, Texas. And so they provided some economic subsidy as an incentive to try to convince immigrants to get out of the Lower East Side ghetto and to take a chance on settling somewhere else. But ultimately, the pull of New York City was too great. And so the idea came, well, if we don't let immigrants set foot on Ellis Island in the first place, if we don't let them see the Lower East Side, right, or Broadway or Central Park, then it'll be much easier to keep them out of New York if they never set foot there in the first place. And that's where the Galveston Movement comes in, okay? So the Galveston Movement was the brainchild of this man, Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff was arguably the most prominent and important American Jew of his time. He was a banker, a financier, and a philanthropist. He was of German Jewish origin. And Schiff committed $500,000 of his own money to support a project that would divert Eastern European Jewish immigration away from Ellis Island and toward an alternate port. And the goal from the very beginning was to try to get between 20 and 25,000 Eastern European Jews into the United States via this alternate port to be determined, excuse me. So why Galveston? Because Galveston actually was not the first choice of the committee working on this project. Other cities were considered. Actually, Charleston was an option. New Orleans at one point was an option. ultimately, Galveston was chosen for a few crucial reasons. First of all, it was linked to Europe via a direct shipping line from Bremen, Germany, which was very important. Also, Galveston was a railroad hub, and this is very important. So immigrants could arrive in Galveston and then from there be put on trains to their final destination. And we'll see in a little while just how wide of a variety the final destinations of the Galveston Movement immigrants were. It's pretty staggering. And then finally, Galveston, remember, only a few years earlier had suffered a devastating hurricane, one of the worst natural disasters in the United States history, the Galveston storm of 1900. And so Galveston was not considered, no offense to the Galvestonians watching this program, Galveston was not considered an ideal destination. There was not a lot of concern that immigrants would get off the boat and decide that they weren't going to leave Galveston. The idea was for them to get on a train somewhere else within 1 to 2 days of their arrival. And for their part, the Galveston Jewish community refused to host these people long term. That they did not want to become the landing spot indefinitely for a bunch of impoverished, Yiddish-speaking, unemployed immigrants that would have devastated their community. One or two more points I want to make about Jacob Schiff and the ideology behind this movement, and then I'll take a look at the chat window and see what comments or questions have come in. It's important to note that Schiff and his associates were anti-Zionists. They believed very strongly that the solution to the Jewish problem in Europe was not the creation of a Jewish state. So they wanted to rescue Jews and get them out of Eastern Europe, but they firmly opposed the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, or for that matter, anywhere else. And they also wanted to encourage Jewish assimilation into American life. Remember that they are operating in an extremely anti-Semitic environment. And so the immigrants that they're bringing over, they don't want them to go to New York, not only because New York is already overcrowded, but by sending them to smaller Jewish communities, they reasoned, these immigrants will be forced to assimilate, right? They'll have to learn English. They will have to get used to working on Saturdays. They will have to get used to probably not being able to find kosher food, at least not so easily. But in the process, Schiff and others hoped, they would demonstrate to the anti-Semites that Jews could make good, loyal, hardworking American citizens, right? They hoped to rebut, to push back against this widespread belief that Eastern European Jews were troublemakers, that they were disease-ridden, that they were incapable of assimilating. So by sending them into the American hinterland, as it were, right, Schiff and the organizers of the Galveston movement, right, hoped to demonstrate that Jews could turn themselves into good Americans. All right. Why else was Galveston such an ideal destination? Well, as many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, Rabbi Henry Cohen was the man on the ground in Galveston. Henry Cohen is arguably the most famous rabbi in Texas history for lots of reasons we don't have time to talk about. And he was the rabbi at Congregation B'nai Israel in Galveston. And there are lots of legends about Rabbi Cohen and his engagement with the Galveston movement. He would meet immigrants on the dock. He came to meet each ship. He spoke fluent Yiddish so he could converse with the immigrants. He helped them to find kosher food. He helped them to find a place right to sleep for the night if they had a delay from when their train was leaving. I should also note that Rabbi Jacob Geller, an Orthodox rabbi, was also present in Galveston in these years and also was of assistance to Jewish immigrants at the time. So having somebody on the ground to meet the ships at the dock like a Rabbi Cohen also made Galveston an ideal choice. All right, I'm going to pause here and I'm going to just take a quick look at everything in the chat window. There's a lot of personal reflections which are really precious, and just helps to demonstrate how vital this story is for so many folks. This is great. We'll see. There's going to be a Houston mix-up we're going to laugh about a little later on. But these comments are wonderful. I hope we can archive these chat comments so that I can follow up with them later. What brought about the general rise in anti-Semitism at the beginning of the 20th century? We spoke about that just briefly. It has to do with a much broader set of changes that are happening in American life from the late 19th to the early 20th centuries, and a shift from rural to urban, from agrarian to industrial, and just the increasing presence and visibility of Jews and Black Americans and other foreigners in American life that really provokes this backlash. Okay, Nina, we'll talk about having jobs lined up in advance, and I don't know about enforced servitude. I don't know a lot about that, but I have heard something about that. All right, why don't we keep going? And we'll talk a little bit now about how this program actually functioned logistically, because it's a very interesting partnership. So how do you get Yiddish-speaking immigrants from the shtetl to Galveston? How did it work? So the movement was a partnership between two Jewish organizations, the Jewish Territorial Organization, or ITO, operating in London and Kiev, that's where its offices were, and the Jewish Immigrants Information Bureau, or JIIB, which had offices both in New York and in Galveston. And here's how the partnership worked, and we'll see this play out here in a few minutes. So the ITO in Europe was responsible for recruiting candidates, for finding immigrants who were willing to come to Galveston. And they collected data about their job skills via questionnaires that they distributed. And their files, by the way, are available at the National Archives in Jerusalem. And so you're looking here at the screen at a Jewish Immigrants Information Bureau roster. So this is one example of the roster of Jewish immigrants on a Galveston ship. And you can see they're listed by name, their ages are listed, and their trades are listed. So this is pursuant to one of the chat comments. So they wanted to match you, if you were a Galveston immigrant, so to speak. The idea was you would declare on the questionnaire, I'm a shoemaker, or I'm a tailor, or I'm a locksmith, okay? And then you would be matched with, through a job placement service, with opportunities in different American cities who were, at least in theory, right, looking for a locksmith or a cabinet maker or a tailor and whatever, all right? Okay, so that's how that worked. And then, so once the immigrants landed in Galveston, the JIIB had already arranged for them to go on to another city where somebody would meet them and then, provide them with housing and this job that they had been supposedly promised. Okay, it's important to mention before we talk about this this next exciting item that from the outset, the organizers of the Galveston movement never intended that these immigrants would stay, forget in Galveston, in Texas at all. They really did not see Texas as an ideal destination for these immigrants. They wanted to get them more into the Midwest, but that would change. The immigrants, in spite of the organizers' intentions, often elected to stay in Texas for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they came over because they had family already living here in Dallas or in San Antonio, as in the case of Alexander Gurwitz, who was a Galveston immigrant that we know a lot about. because his memoirs have been published and edited by my friend Brian Stone. In other cases, right, they got off the boat and they were real sick of traveling. As we'll talk about, this was a 3-week journey by ship. And I can imagine easily that a lot of folks were fed up with traveling and didn't want to take a 12-hour, train ride to Fargo, North Dakota. Hey, I'll just, go up the road to Houston, or I'll go up the road to, San Antonio, and I'll take my chances. Finally, though, however, against the wishes of the JIIB, the Jewish Territorial Organization, the ITO, produced this pamphlet that we're about to look at in 1907, and it included pages of information about Texas. So the immigrants who came over, at least in the first years of this venture, to the extent that they knew anything about America outside of New York, they knew something about Texas because of this advertising pamphlet. So now let me tell you about this pamphlet. So this is the pamphlet that was printed in Eastern Europe and distributed to Eastern European Jews to convince them to come to Galveston. And thanks to funding provided to us by the Joan and Stanford Alexander Foundation, we were actually able to purchase this pamphlet. We own it in the library at Rice, and we've digitized it. And as Rabbi Morgan mentioned, I have an article coming out in the fall of this year in the Journal of Southern Jewish History that will include the translation of this pamphlet by Maurice Wolfthal and my scholarly essay about it. So this is it. This is the ad campaign. You're going to look at it. It's pretty incredible. So in translation, we would say it's called Important Information Concerning Immigration to Galveston in the state of Texas by the Jewish Territorial Organization, and the year is 1907. So here's what the pamphlet looks like inside. Here's the first page of it. And we're going to look now at some of Maurice's translation. Just a moment. Okay. So here's what the immigrants read. Galveston is a port that is connected by trains to a large, rich region with many cities, with factories and large businesses. The whole region is now at the same level where New York was 25 years ago, before it was flooded with immigrants. For that reason, Galveston and the whole area, the southwestern states of the United States of America, Texas, Iowa, Kansas, Colorado, Missouri, Dakota, and still more states, are a good place to emigrate to now. Craftsmen in every trade can earn a very good living, and workers also. There's a place for commerce too. As a rule, an immigrant can't become a businessman as soon as he arrives, only later when he has mastered the language, English, and has gotten used to the place. In the beginning, you just have to work at anything. And that bold is actually original to the Yiddish pamphlet. You cannot get employment as a ritual slaughterer, a rabbi, a cantor, or a teacher because you have to know English. The climate is good, warm. Food is not expensive, cheaper than in New York in any case. Wages are higher than in New York. The laws and statutes are the same as in the rest of America. The people are civilized and friendly to Jews. Isn't this fascinating? This is just so great. So a couple notes here, right? One of the things that I think this pamphlet is aiming to do is to sell immigrants on the idea that the golden age of New York has passed, right? Like if you were going to immigrate to America and you were thinking about New York, the time to do that was 25 years ago. Now, right, the hot place to immigrate to, the place where you're going to find the best opportunity is Texas and these other surrounding states. It's not New York. So selling, Texas and selling the Midwest and the South as the kind of new New York, as it were, I think is a really fascinating rhetorical strategy for the ITO to try to take. Also note here how they attempt to sort of create but also temper expectations. So you can make a living in any trade, and there's a place for commerce, but the pamphlet cautions, right, you have to be patient, right? You've got to learn English. It takes a while, and you just have to get going. You have to be willing to try your hand at whatever job opportunity comes your way, and be willing to work your way up. And then finally, the pamphlet is already hinting that we're not looking for rabbis, right? If your plan is to come over here and to be a rabbi, to be a shochet, to be a kosher slaughterer, to be a malamed, right? Somebody who's gonna, teach children in the cheder how to read Hebrew and, chant Torah and whatever, right? We're not looking for those people. You have to be English speaking. You're not going to be able to make it in the cities that we're sending you to, in those kind of religious functionary positions. But aside from that, right, the climate is warm. I don't know if the climate is warm in, Colorado and North Dakota, but all the things that are great about New York, right? All of the, protections and legal rights that Jews enjoy in New York, they enjoy in the rest of America too. And it's a place where the people are civilized and friendly to Jews. There's no anti-Semitism. Isn't that wonderful? And then it says here, and this is an important point, point 3, you have to be totally healthy. American officials will not permit entry to the sick, the weak, those with trachoma infections in the eyes, mange, a bald spot in the middle of the head, lung problems, nervous diseases, and so not capable of working. If you're sick, don't come. And to read, these guidelines given to potential immigrants in 2021, now 2022, in the era of, COVID testing and all of that is a kind of an interesting moment. What is this kind of medical cautionary language doing here? Well, if you've been to the museum at Ellis Island, you know that when immigrants got off the boat, they were subjected to a fairly rigorous set of screening tests, one of which was a medical test. And if you failed that medical inspection, you were sent back to Europe in many cases. And one of the things we're going to be talking about in a few minutes is the issue of deportations. It's going to be a vital and sad, unfortunate piece to this story. So anybody who had any kind of deformity or illness such that they wouldn't pass that medical inspection, the guidance from the ITO was don't come. And it's important to note further that if you failed the medical inspection, not only were you sent back to Europe, but you were sent back on the steamship company's dime. So they would be liable for sending these people back to Europe at their own expense. And if they're sending, if they're facilitating the free passage of a lot of sickly people, the organizers figure, right, the program is going to get shut down. We're not going to be able to do this anymore. So there's a rigorous kind of pre-screening process that immigrants were asked to undertake prior to becoming a Galveston Movement immigrant. All right, I'm going to step out again of the share, and I'm just going to peek quickly at comments and questions in the chat window. Okay, thank you, Lonnie. Were there non-Jews on these ships? Yes, absolutely. As we talked about earlier, right, Jews were among many groups of Europeans coming to the United States in large numbers in this era. And so it's not only Jews who are making this journey, but it is Jews for whom this special program through the ITO and the JIIB was created. We haven't really talked about the finances of this project, right? But I should note just briefly that this journey was subsidized. So Eastern European Jewish immigrants, and the pamphlet describes this, we don't have time to look at it, if you want to see the whole pamphlet, I can share it with you now that the translation is just a few months away from being published. Basically, you had to get yourself to Bremen, to Germany, where the boat would leave, and then you got subsidized passage from Bremen, Germany to Galveston. So it was a pretty significant financial benefit if you were willing to take a chance on Galveston. Okay, let's go back in now, and we're going to look at the second half of the pamphlet. So the first half of this pamphlet, which again, we're very grateful to the Alexander Foundation for making it possible for us to acquire it. We just anecdotally, at the Houston Jewish History Archive, we're always looking out for rare Texas Jewish books and pamphlets and memorabilia, and we were able to acquire this from a rare Jewish book dealer in New York, which is, I'm very happy that it's in Houston, it's in Texas, and that we've been able to preserve it, digitize it, and translate it. There's only one other library that I'm aware of in the world that has a copy of this. So that's really exciting. So after the pamphlet goes through a lengthy discussion of why Galveston is a good place to immigrate to, the health requirements, there's language in here about luggage and how much luggage you can bring and when the ships leave and so on and so forth. Then we get a couple pages description of Texas. What is Texas, right? Obviously, your average Yiddish-speaking Russian Jew in 1907 has never heard of Texas. So what is this place that you're going to be coming to? And those of you who can read a little bit of Yiddish will be able to, see this here on screen. So some information about the state of Texas circa 1907. And again, I'm so grateful to Maurice Wolfthal for providing this translation. So here's what it says in Yiddish. The state of Texas is the largest of all the United States. Remember, it's 1907. So keep that in mind. It occupies some 262,000 English square miles and is larger, for example, than all of France. Its soil is especially fertile for grazing cattle and cotton plants. Except for its southern section, its climate is good for your health, especially in the winter months. So to those of us in Houston and Galveston, right, with apologies, there's a little bit of disparagement here of the South Texas climate. Okay, who lives in Texas? The population of the state consists of Englishmen, Spaniards, Germans, Frenchmen, Negroes, Indians, and others. There are Jews in significant numbers only in the larger cities, especially Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Galveston. The population of the state is approximately 3 million people. Compared to its huge area of territory, its population is very small. The state still has lots of empty space for new immigrants. So again, and in contradiction to the wishes of the JIIB, the ITO is trying to sell Texas as a good place to go to, right? It's big, it's open, there's lots of land, it's fairly diverse, right? As a Jewish immigrant, you will not be the only non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant living there. Full disclosure, there are only significant Jewish communities in the larger cities. And as we'll see, it's going to go on to describe what that looks like. So there's information in here about Galveston, Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, and I think also Waco and El Paso. Just very brief paragraph length descriptions of what they each offer. It's very interesting to note, and I'm not going to read, it's already 11:45. So I'm not going to read this word for word, but I just want you to note two things about the way that the pamphlet describes Galveston and Houston. So number one, Galveston is a large port. It has various industries, but the cost of living is not cheap in Galveston. And it tells you how much it costs to rent an apartment, how much basic foodstuffs cost in Galveston. So the ITO is trying to get you to go to Galveston, but not stay there. Okay, and here's Houston. Houston is 50 miles from Galveston Port, where the ships from Europe the ships from Europe dock. Houston is a very important industrial city, and it talks about the various industries here where, quote, healthy, capable workers can find employment. It says that there are about 2,500 Jews living in Houston as of 1907. The Jewish community has its own synagogue, several prayer and study houses, and various charitable institutions and associations. So if you know your Houston Jewish history, as I'm sure many of you do, this is a perplexing comment, because in 1907, Houston had a Dath Yeshurun, but it also had Beth Israel, which was the oldest organized Jewish house of worship in Texas, originally created as an Orthodox synagogue, but by 1907 it was well established as a Reform community. So I parse this to mean that Beth Israel is not even on the radar screen for the organizers of this program, for the ITO, right? I assume that by own synagogue it means a Dath Yeshurun, and we're going to hear more from a Dath Yeshurun actually in a minute. Dath Yeshurun being the forerunner congregation to Beth Yeshurun, which is sponsoring this program today. And it says also there were several prayer and study houses. So by 1907, if I'm not mistaken, Adath Emeth had already been established as another Orthodox congregation. And I forget exactly when Adath Israel was established, but it may have also been created. But I'm guessing that Beth Israel, the Reform community, is not even an option, right, for Eastern European Jews in 1907. So we're not even going to mention it, which is really, I think, fascinating to me. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about, as I just peek at the chat window. All right, thank you, Lonnie, for handling a lot of the chat comments. Where did these people go? So my colleague and friend Brian Stone, who teaches at Del Mar College in Corpus Christi and is esteemed historian of Texas Jewish history in his own right. His research in part has focused on the statistics about what happened to these Galveston immigrants after they docked. And it's thanks to Brian that we actually know quite a bit about where Galveston immigrants went. And I'm just going to show you two tables that Brian Stone compiled and then published in the Journal of Southern Jewish History. So as you can see here, no surprise, Texas was the most popular destination state for Galveston Movement immigrants. So more than 2,000, or roughly 26% of all the Galveston immigrants who came in between 1907 and 1913, so not quite the end of the program, but close to it, stayed in Texas. But after that, you can see that the Midwest was far and away the largest destination. So Iowa, Missouri, and Minnesota took the next largest numbers on the list. And you can see Nebraska and then California and Louisiana round out the most popular destinations by state. When we go deeper and we look at city, we get a slightly different picture. So as some of you probably know because of your family histories, Kansas City, Missouri took more Galveston Movement immigrants than any other city by a fair margin here, with St. Paul, Minnesota coming in second, followed by Omaha, Nebraska, followed by Houston in fourth place. Interesting. Houston is always in fourth place, right? We're the fourth largest city in America as of 2022, I think, and the fourth largest city for Galveston Movement immigrants. It's a fun kind of irony there. Galveston makes the list, as does Fort Worth, but then you have other destinations in the Midwest. Now, why did immigrants choose to go to City A as opposed to City B? How much agency did they have in the process? And this is a question that I think historians are still trying to answer. On the one hand, the JIIB was working assiduously to try to place immigrants in cities that had job opportunities. They wanted them to get into the Midwest. Part of their goal really was to build up Midwestern Jewish community life with the infusion of these immigrants. However, we also see in the files of the JIIB that sometimes immigrants had their own ideas. So as we said before, maybe they were coming to join family already settled in Kansas City or St. Paul or Houston. Or maybe while they were on the boat on the way over, they befriended a guy who himself was headed to Kansas City. And so they decided to follow their new buddy in a strange new country to Kansas City for that reason. So trying to parse out exactly who went where and why, is a question that we're continuing to try to unravel. I think it's ultimately going to be a lot of case by case situations. So I want to speak now about what challenges and limitations this program faced. Because ultimately, fewer than 10,000 Jewish immigrants entered this program, which was less than half of the original goal, right? The target that Jacob Schiff set when he set aside $500,000 for this program was to try to get between 20 and 25,000 immigrants. So they didn't even quite get to 50%. Why not? What challenges did they face? There were several. The first challenge was the journey itself. So to get from Bremen, Germany to Galveston, Texas, at that time took about 3 weeks, which is longer than the journey from Europe to New York and Ellis Island. So the journey is longer. More time at sea means more exposure, more likelihood that you're going to run out of food or become ill. And so when these immigrants arrived, as we'll see in a second, some historians speculate that they arrived sicker because they had been at sea longer. Immigrants also complained. They complained to the JIIB about how awful the ship journey was, and they wrote letters back home to relatives, and they talked about verbal abuse, and they talked about the quality of the food, and they talked about the cleanliness of the ship, and they basically encouraged their family members not to come, at least not to come through Galveston. So there was a lot of bad PR, I guess you'd say, from the immigrants themselves, trickling back to Europe and trickling to the movement organizers themselves, that they had to contend with. And the organizers, the JIIB tried to work with the ship company to improve conditions. Ultimately, they were frustrated in that effort. The other challenge that proved ultimately fatal to the Galveston movement was, surprisingly perhaps, the extremely harsh enforcement of rules and a high deportation rate at Galveston versus Ellis Island. Now, far fewer immigrants are coming through Galveston than are coming through Ellis Island. And again, if you've been to the Seaport Museum in Galveston, if you've been to the museum at Ellis Island, you have a sense of this. But in a nutshell, the rate of deportation of immigrants at Galveston was as high at one point as almost 6% compared to 1% at Ellis Island. And there's some question among historians as to why that is. Is it because the immigration inspectors at Galveston were more anti-Semitic than the immigration inspectors at Ellis Island? It could be. Is it because immigrants arrived sicker at Galveston than they did at Ellis Island because they had been at sea for an extra week or for several extra days? Also could be. But ultimately, with such a high deportation rate, it became hard to justify continuing the program. We even know that immigrants who were turned away at Galveston were actually able to enter the United States through Ellis Island, which is in itself a kind of damning piece of evidence. And then finally, if that weren't enough, in the early 1900s, America went through a series of economic depressions, foreshadowing to an extent the Great Depression of the 1930s. But during any kind of economic crunch, right, it's hard to find jobs, and it's especially hard to find jobs for new immigrants who don't speak English yet, right, who are not assimilated, who are not used to American working conditions and working standards. And so all of this kind of came to a head in 1914. But because this talk has been sponsored by Congregation Beth Yeshurun here in Houston, I would be remiss if I didn't bring some Beth Yeshurun history to bear on the Galveston Movement. So this is a letter that Rabbi Wolf Wilner, then the rabbi of Congregation Adath Yeshurun, the forerunner congregation to Beth Yeshurun, as we noted, sent to Morris Waldman, the chief bureau agent of the JIIB, in December 20th of 1907. This is not a letter that we have in the Houston Jewish History Archive here at Rice University. This is in the files of the Jewish Territorial Organization, I believe, in Jerusalem. But I have a PDF of the letter that was shared with me by my colleague, Brian Stone. So here's what Rabbi Wilner writes to the JIIB in December of 1907. My dear Mr. Waldman, very, very sorry, but I cannot give any encouragement. My people just simply will not hear of it. My heart bleeds for the fact, but it is just simply impossible. What's impossible? We'll find out. We are $200 behind as it is, and where in the world we will get the money in these hard times, I do not know. The fault lies with the European committees. They ought to be wrapped over the knuckles. It seems that they vie with each other to show off how many people they send to America, and they take men from their livings and induce them under false pretenses to come here. Continuing on, take the case of Salzburg, a very nice and honorable man. He earned in Bremen 44 marks a week, but the rabbi worked on him so long till he gave up his position there, came to Galveston, thence to Houston, went around idle for 6 weeks, till at last he got a job out of pity, with enough to keep body and soul together and not a cent to spare for his family in Europe. He is not inclined to write a letter of thanks to the ITO and does not bless the rabbi in Bremen. Not one who came here but has his story of extravagant promises made by the committee, promises which are not only products of an enlarged imagination, but absolute lies. I have a very heavy burden to carry through this foul race among the various European committees. This is great. Pay attention here. The men show me the Yiddish pamphlet circulated in Russia. Did you ever see one? From the way Houston is spelled therein, right, and I think he means to say Houston, we can tell they were written in New York, where they have Houston Street, and therefore by men who had to rely on their inventive genius. What harm does it do them to burden our communities and to make men unhappy? They get so much a line, I presume. And yet for the sake of the cause, I've kept silent and tried to do my level best. It was hard work to keep down the protests of the members of my local committee, to continue telling them that despite everything, all must be done. But when your letter asking us to entertain 2 more men is read to them, bedlam is loose. I am sorry, very sorry, but it just cannot be done. We need money now. We owe and cannot collect. We have our share, and the committee thinks we have more than our share. Hoping that an outlet will be found, and that henceforth our committees in Europe will not be so anxious to increase the number of tickets they procure, I am, with kindest regards to all, most regretfully yours, W. Wilner. And you can see here the annotation from Morris Waldman. Dear, I think it's addressed to David Bressler at the JIIB. We give Houston no financial help. So what's going on here? What's Wilner complaining about? Number one, the local Houston committee charged with settling and assisting Galveston immigrants, they're $200 in debt, and they don't know where that money is going to come from. And now the JIB has written to them and said, please take 2 more immigrants. And Wilner and his committee have had it, right? They don't have the money. They don't have the funds or the capability to take more immigrants. So, maybe it doesn't read so charitably from the hindsight of 2022, but I think it's an interesting illustration of the challenges that, people on the ground faced. From Wilner's perspective, right, the ITO and the JIB are just, in an arms race to, put Houston and Kansas City and Dallas and St. Paul into a kind of competition, who can take the most immigrants. But Wilner is saying, look, you can't keep sending us people. We don't have jobs for them. We don't have the money to, get them on their feet. You gotta stop. So it's a really important, primary source demonstrating the challenges that ultimately the Galveston movement could not overcome. Okay. All right. A quick peek at the chat window. All right. Okay. So we have to talk about Jewish immigrants in Texas after 1914. I will try to address that when we're done here. Okay. So what happens? By April 1914, it's clear that the Galveston movement cannot continue. So Schiff gets together with the other members of the JIB. They look at the budget. They look at the numbers. They see that at its height, only 3% of the stream of Jewish immigration to the United States is coming through Galveston. So they haven't made, in their eyes, a significant dent. They haven't succeeded in diverting the flow of immigration away from Ellis Island and into Galveston. So they decide, okay, by the end of September in 1914, we are going to pull the plug. We're going to call it quits. Now, of course, what they don't know in April of 1914 is that a world war is going to break out in August of that year, effectively making international travel impossible, along with immigration. So if they hadn't made this choice in April, right, August would have made the decision for them. So it would have ended in 1914 anyway. The reasons that they gave in their final meeting were, again, the lack of adequate transportation for these immigrants to get them from Bremen to Texas, and the unduly severe enforcement, as they write, of the immigration laws at Galveston Island. So what do we do with this now? The JIB relocated somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 immigrants, ultimately through Galveston, primarily men, but also women and children, it should be said. But again, this was less than half of the hoped for number, and less than 3% of the total immigration from Eastern Europe over that time. So how do we look back on the legacy of the Galveston movement? It didn't succeed in bringing tens of thousands of Eastern European Jews into Middle America. It didn't succeed in turning Jews away from New York and getting them to come into Galveston and into the Midwest instead. So by those hard numbers, right, you would consider the project a failure. However, I think there's another way to view the legacy of this program. And those of you watching today who are the descendants of Galveston movement immigrants are a testament to this, right? That between 9,000 and 10,000 Jews did get out of Eastern Europe before World War I. They did come to the United States and were able, in many cases, to find employment, to establish families, to have children and grandchildren, and in a lot of meaningful ways to really contribute to the building of Jewish communities outside of the East Coast, in Texas also, but also in Missouri and in Iowa and in Colorado and in Minnesota. And so the history, not just of Jewish Texas, but the history of really the Jewish Midwest as well, I think to some extent owes a debt to this um, project. So it's already 12:06. I want to just share with you my contact information. If you'd like to follow up with me, if you have a question that we didn't have time to answer, my email and my phone number are here on the screen. I've also shared a link to the website and homepage of the Houston Jewish History Archive. So as we mentioned at the outset, if you joined the program late, I'm the founder and curator of the Houston Jewish History Archive. We collect, preserve, and digitize important historical records about Jewish life in Houston and across South Texas. And we try to have exhibits and public programs like this one. And I'm just so grateful to this community, to Beth Yeshurun, to our donors and supporters for enabling this work. I'm going to look again now at the chat window and just see if there's any comments that I can address. I want to encourage everybody, as Jan Hart notes, if you liked this program, the Texas Jewish Historical Society is a wonderful organization here in the state that does a lot of work to promote Texas Jewish history, and they've provided us with funding as well. And you also can donate to support the Houston Jewish History Archive, and that link is on our website as well. Our ability to hire student interns, our ability to expand our staff, and ultimately to expand our work beyond Houston to all of Texas, it really does take community support, and we're so grateful for that. I should mention that immigration to Galveston did occur prior to 1907. So I don't want you to walk away from this program believing that it's only in 1907 that immigrants first started to come through Galveston. Of course, that's not true. Of course, the Jewish community in Texas is much older than that, right? By several decades. Beth Israel and B'nai Israel and many Texas cities, right, have a Jewish community to speak of by the 1850s and 1860s. Galveston did continue to serve as a port of immigration after World War I, but not nearly on the same level, and not really as a port of direct entry for Jewish immigrants. Right, Jews tended to find their way to Texas via New York or via Baltimore or other East Coast ports, and would come down often by train, either following a relative or following a job opportunity. So the sort of golden age of Galveston as an immigration hub does coincide with this period. Okay. All right. I'm gonna put my I'm gonna put my contact information here in the chat as well, so that if you missed it on the slide or if it's hard to read, you can see it. And I'm also, in the remaining minutes that I have, I'm going to post a link to some of the digital resources, not related to the Galveston movement per se, but of the Houston Jewish History Archive, so that you can peruse them on your own time. And this is ultimately where the original pamphlet that we looked at today will be made available. So Houston Jewish History Archive digital catalog link. Our oral histories are also in here, and we've done a number of oral histories with Galveston Jews. Irving Posmentier, Aubrey Farb, I know, is in here. We just did an interview with Sonia Farb-Reyes that talks about Texas City and Galveston. Hi, David. Almost on cue. So I hope you'll take advantage of that. Please do reach out to me. It's been a pleasure and an honor to spend time with you. I want you all to stay well, stay safe, have a great 2022. And I hope you'll join us again for more programs in Texas Jewish history.
So I want to, on behalf of Beth Yeshurun, thank Josh Furman for a wonderful presentation. You can see why he's such a popular and informative and engaging speaker. It's been a very successful program, I can see from all the comments here. And thank you all for joining us. This program will be available on our YouTube channel for those who missed it or want to go back and see it again. And please do stay in touch, and we'll be having Josh, of course, back for future talks in the coming months and years. So thank you all for coming. And on behalf of Beth Yeshurun, thank you, Josh Furman, for such a wonderful presentation.
My pleasure. Take care, everybody. Do be in touch.